Can someone confirm online if you can hear me before starting? Perfect. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for being here in our fifth, I think, seminar on tertiary education in England. Today we have the pleasure to have two presenters discussing and examining the possibility of integration in a dual sector. First, we are going to start with the presentation of Professor Chris Millward. The presentation is titled A New Model for England, the Potential for Dual Sector Integration to Support Pathways and Reduce Polarisation in Tertiary Education. Chris is Professor of Practice in Education Policy at the University of Birmingham and also Interim Director of Fair Access and Participation at the Office for Students. His work focuses on issues of equity and inclusion, the role of education system in local and national prosperity, and how those systems can be improved. Immediately after Chris' presentation, we will hear from Professor Leesa Wheelahan, the presentation titled Possibilities and Challenges Confronting Dual Sector Institutions. Leesa is Professor Emerita at the University of Toronto, an honorary research fellow in the Department of Education here in Oxford, and her research focuses on the role of theoretical knowledge in qualifications, equity and social justice in tertiary education, pathways between tertiary education sectors, and education policy. Each presentation is going to last around 30 minutes. And then after the two presentations, we are going to have around 25 minutes for questions and comments. This session, as the other sessions previously, is going to be recorded. So you are going to be able to find the recording in our YouTube channel or on Monday. So, Chris,
Great.
to you.
Okay, thank you. Well, thanks Gonzalo, and thanks to Leesa and Gavin for organising this series, which is very timely given what's happening with policy in all parts of the and elsewhere. I mean, I've been interested in tertiary education, although people don't tend to talk a lot about tertiary in this country. For about 20 years, since I worked at the Higher Education Funding Council on the configuration of further education and higher education in the east of England and then the north of England, and I'll use some examples of that vision there. And I came back to thinking a lot about it when I previously worked as Director of Fair Access and then moved into university about 4 years ago. And I became very interested at that point because it felt to me that however legitimate some of the challenges the government at that time was making to increasing higher education participation, for example, in relation to inequalities and the outcomes arising from that and the cost of it, it felt like they were trying to manage down access to higher education without a coherent vision for the whole system. In other words, if fewer people go into HE, what other pathways are they going to take through the post-compulsory education system, indeed back into HE or into HE at later points, which made me start to engage with people like James and others who were thinking about a more coherent tertiary education system. And obviously around that time, there were interesting developments in Wales and has been in Scotland since. So it's great to be, I'm now back for a couple of days a week working with the AFS, and it's great to be doing that, having spent a few years listening to discussions like this, where we have a better sense of the concepts, the history, what's happening in other countries, and the data. And I think this series is a really great platform for us to think about how we bring that to bear in policy in England and elsewhere during the coming years. So I'm going to cover, during the course of the half an hour, a bit of a picture about patterns of participation and funding across further and higher education, really broadly during the 21st century. And I'm interested in policy during the 21st century. Also look at the policies that might have influenced those patterns across that broadly 25-year period and how they have played out in terms of the configuration of institutions across FE and HE, with a particular reference to place. You'll see later on that I've got a couple of maps, and I did try to do this through my university's AI partner, and it gave me 3 versions of the University of Cambridge, all in the wrong place and spelled wrongly. So I decided to use instead some maps that we actually produced in the University Funding Council 20 years ago, and make a virtue of using historical artifacts rather than my technological incompetence. But they do give you a good picture of where we were 20 years ago and what we were trying to achieve and where we are now, and what's happened to the kind of configuration of FE and HE and relationships between them across this period. One of the things I've been reflecting on in terms of the structure of this is the factors influencing the patterns I'll describe. And at one level, there's ideology. So you can see a Labour coalition, Conservative Labour governments, and broadly the Conservative-led governments giving more emphasis to private finance and markets across this period. But there's also external events. So, crucially, the banking crash, which potentially has affected for a very long period of time the economy in this country, household prosperity, and certainly public spending. And that's a major influence over the last 25 years. The other major influence during the last 10 years is the effects of Brexit, which I think has given much more attention to people who aren't going to university and places without universities because of the pattern of that vote. And I think it's very important in terms of policies now. So you've got ideologies, you've got events. The other thing is kind of broader cultural attitudes and the extent to which universities are embedded in our assumptions about stratification in this country and associated with upward mobility, and how that affects choices that are made about study, and choices about institutional priorities, which Anne-Marie reflected on a bit in her presentation. The fourth factor I was going to find is money. So a lot of the changes that have happened here have started with money. So how do we make this affordable? And then how do we find a way of making that affordability work as a system through the way in which it's regulated, etc. So money is a kind of reality. And it'd be good to reflect on how you see the interaction of those things as we go through it. So just to start with the patterns. So broadly, and I don't hear this a lot from my colleagues, but the last 25 years has been pretty successful for universities. So, what this basically shows you is a doubling of income to universities in real terms over broadly a quarter of a century. So shown in the amber chart there, a doubling of academic staff, twice as many academic staff as we had at the turn of the century, and research income, which tends to be particularly important to certainly some groups of universities, also increasing in real terms. So a huge pattern of growth across this period. Of course, that pattern has been made possible by shifting the system to being mostly funded by fee income, or substantially funded by fee income. So broadly, the percentage of fee income going up from around 20% to well over half at this point, and becoming a much more substantial part of the system than it was before. The other important dimension in terms of the changes in the higher education system is there's much more reliance on overseas students who pay full fees than there were before. So broadly, overseas students moving from around 10% of students to around 25% of students now. Obviously, that at one level is a shift from public funding to private funding, although it's not as clear cut as that, because the domestic element, as we'll go on to talk about, is backed by income contingent loans, backed by the government, but certainly the overseas component is private funding. But I think in addition to the source of the funding, there's how it's determined. So it's shifting from public to private determination of where the resources go. So when you move the money to the fee, it's shifting it towards student choice. That's really what is driving the system once you move so much of it towards the fee. And it's been interesting to see how student choice has really shaped the system over that 25 years. I think 20 years ago, we thought that student choice and increasing participation would mean that universities would diversify to meet the needs of a bigger population in different places. In other words, we would change to go out to them. Actually, a system driven by student choice, they've come to us. So as you can see on the right-hand side, full-time degrees have become a much bigger part of the system. The percentage of students studying part-time below the level of a degree has diminished really quite dramatically from about a quarter to about 5% across in the red line shown across this period. And of course, the part of higher education that's delivered by further education colleges tends to be below the level of a degree, intermediate level qualifications, more often part-time, serving that more flexible provision. So what you've kind of seen is, as you move towards a system driven by student choice, is a kind of shift upwards in demand and supply towards full degree level study. Students given their one voucher in their lifetime going for a full degree. Universities given the opportunity to recruit whoever they can, going for students who'll stay for as long as possible and using their market power to take more of the market. And that's a dynamic between universities and colleges, and also high-profile, selective, research-intensive universities compared to others. So there's an interesting dynamic driving a pattern of HE, which is really shifting it away from the kind of HE that FE colleges would be more likely to deliver. I think another important dimension of how some of this has played out is what's happened to further education funding and skills funding and activity. And broadly, what you can see here on the chart on the left-hand side, which is from the IFS, is diminishing funding over the period for further education skills overall. Work-based learning and apprenticeships just about holding up, and some increases in the most recent years. That's work-based learning and apprenticeships in yellow. But overall, a pretty challenging funding climate for further education skills overall. And then similarly, in terms of the volume of activity, this is data from the DFE, broadly a reduction of volume overall, with again, apprenticeships and work-based learning in the grey, probably holding up a bit more than some of the other areas. But overall, a declining pattern of funding and activity across further education skills. So overall, across the tertiary system, the kind of things that FE colleges do, perhaps coming under pressure at a time when universities and full degrees are really expanding. So how did we get here? So I'm going to roll back. I don't know if anyone's watching the Tony Blair documentary this week. It's really interesting. But if you haven't watched it, the episode last night, the Permanent Secretary, Richard Wilson, said, I sat down with Tony Blair in 2001 when he just won his second term. And I said to him, this is your moment of greatest power. And what are you going to do? And most of the programme was about his foreign adventures. But actually, one of the things he did do is set a target for 50% higher education participation in 2001. That was a real signal policy at that time. Obviously, the way in which he decided that would be funded, and the Labour government decided that would be funded, which was embedded in the Higher Education Act of 2004 and the white paper around that time, was introducing a £3,000 fee, which was at the time seemed to be a substantial uplift, but also introducing a key feature of the system ever since, which was income contingent loans, which had actually been recommended by Deering about 4 years previously, but not really flowed through until then. And that has, of course, been a growing part of our system and very importantly in the news over the last couple of weeks. I think there's no doubt that Blair and the new Labour government had a slightly rose-tinted view of the knowledge economy. So they felt that if you invested in knowledge and skills, increasing participation to higher education and higher levels of study, that itself would drive the growth of the economy and jobs that needed higher levels of knowledge and skills. And indeed, qualifications would ensure that positions in the knowledge economy would be allocated according to merit. I mean, that's a very great simplification, but if you read the documents like that white paper, that's really what it's trying to say. And it's a classic bit of kind of third way triangulation. So we can have fairness and dynamism, we can have opportunity and growth all at the same time. And that's what this was trying to achieve. And it's kind of easy to be critical of that, but there was also a plan. So I think there was a plan to try to put it into effect, and it was possible to put it into effect because there was substantial public funding, as well as the fee in the higher education space, or the contributions from employers in the further education and skills place. So there was a lot of quite clear thinking about how you'd use the public funding component to take provision out to the people who you wanted to bring into the system. And in the higher education space, that was about using public funding to develop foundation degrees, really 2-year intermediate qualifications, which would mostly be delivered by further education colleges, funding lifelong learning networks, which were enabling progression between FE and HE and guarantees of progression between the two. A lot of use of capital funding to take further and higher education to places that didn't have it, particularly didn't have higher education. So new centres on the high street that were intended to enable progression, often later in life, through FE to HE in places that didn't have it already. So there was kind of a plan to try and shape this and make it happen. Alongside that, in 2006, there was the Leach Review of Skills, which in a similar way was basically committing to spend £2 billion more on adult skills, but with the aim that employers would match that, and that would drive up activity. And so even though Blair is often characterised as focusing on 50% higher education, they were trying to talk about prosperity for all and a kind of joined up system which brought FE and HE together in a more lifelong view. One of the challenges for actually sustaining that and put it into effect is really what happens to the economy. So what I was talking about external events. So in 2008, we had the banking crash, and as shown on the left-hand side, on the right-hand side here, this is GDP per person in the UK. Our trajectory of GDP per person, this is work from the House of Lords, has never really recovered from what happened in 2007-08. And of course, that has implications for that promise, for what the investment in knowledge and skills would achieve in terms of returns. But it also had a dramatic effect on public spending. And within this public spending, further and higher education were unprotected. In other words, so at a time when a new government came in 2010-11 and started to shift spending downwards on the green line away from the previously planned levels, further and higher education were really at the front line in terms of savings that would need to be made at that time. So that kind of public spending that was doing the shaping function in the previous vision really came under pressure. I think that's really the key driver of some of the reforms that followed since. So there's definitely, coming back to what I was saying earlier, an ideology of greater private finance and markets from 2010 onwards. But there's before that a problem of just meeting the public spending targets and finding a way of financing at least the current level of activity, but in a way that enables that kind of reduction in public spending that was planned. And crucially, that's delivered in the HE space by the vote in Parliament that tripled the fee and removed 2/3 of the education grant to universities, but also a white paper that started to talk much more about student choice.
Where we
providers.
The Americans won their match of Switzerland. So.
I'm just pausing because I can hear something online. Don't know if you can go on mute. Thanks. So alongside the shift towards students paying more, a kind of ideology of market forces flowing through from the 2011 white paper, and that's actually a lot of the public debate now is about Plan 2 loans, which flow from that period. In addition to asking the perceived beneficiaries, the students, to pay more on the higher education side, there are decisions to ask the perceived beneficiaries on the skills side to pay as well. So the introduction of apprenticeships levy, which comes through initially from the budget in 2005, the Technical and Further Education Act, which establishes a regulator to make that work. And then you have essentially a regulator in higher education that's focusing on consumers and enabling new providers, and a regulator in the apprenticeship sphere also focusing on serving the beneficiaries, the employers who set standards and determine what goes through. And it's interesting to reflect on the positioning of FE colleges across all of this. So whereas before there might have been a thinking around FE colleges delivering a particular character of higher education and thinking in a coherent way about how that fits in this world, FE colleges are just part of the competition. In fact, at one point there was an explicit endeavour to move places into FE colleges because they offered higher education more cheaply. So you just got a register of providers where everybody's providing different types of higher education provision and competing rather than thinking coherently across the two. It feels like quite a fragmented system. So you've got different drivers coming through in the further education world from the higher education world, and not a lot of join up between the two compared to where we may have been a few years before. That's quite important because I think also, as this is all coming into effect in the middle of the last decade, we're also hitting a period of significant political polarisation and fragmentation within which educational qualifications and educational experiences are playing quite an important role. So in 2016, there is the vote on Brexit. I think in broad terms, something like 2/3 of graduates voted against. And again, around 2/3 of graduates voted against the Conservative Party that was committed to implementing it in 2019. And so there was a sense of polarisation around all of that. Similarly, the rise of reform, which has flowed from that, is happening much more among people who haven't been to university and places that don't have universities. So in addition to this kind of fragmentation of the educational landscape, you've got a kind of political fragmentation as well, which has an element of linkage with qualifications. And I think that is playing a very important role in the thinking around policy priorities now, because what's happened during this period has made politicians think much harder about not just the higher education routes, but the other routes through the system and how best to serve the people who are not going through the higher education route, although there are different views about how best to put that into effect. So how I would perceive things over the last 20 years in England is kind of competing visions about how to serve everyone. One vision being more binary. In other words, we need a more tightly controlled higher education system, and then a more direct investment in the technical and vocational education system, but seen in quite separate terms. That's broadly what you see in the policy in England in 2021 and 2022, with the two white papers shown on the left-hand side here. And then you also, alternatively to that, have a view that actually the way to deal with this, supporting the needs of everyone, is a much more joined up, coherent approach to tertiary education, with Wales leading on that to start with the tertiary bill, Scotland also putting forward a tertiary bill which provides kind of unified oversight of all of that, and England's post-16 white paper essentially trying to achieve some of similar things, but not yet without legislation putting such a unified and coherent system into place. It's worth reflecting on where that leaves us in those three countries. In many ways, Scotland and Wales have better levers to think in a coherent way around tertiary education, but they both have big challenges. So Scotland has still a commitment to free higher education, which is putting pressure on the unit funding for universities and indeed the funding for other parts of the system, and finding it challenging to make that stack up and work. Wales, in addition to some of the exposure that Scotland has to international students, has a big exposure to English students and all the competition in England as well. And those are real challenges for those two countries to get the kind of coherence that they're looking for across their two systems. Although they are both now, interestingly, doing good and progressive things. Tertiary Pathfinders in Scotland, I think, have been a good way of thinking across both parts of the system, and some of the way in which Wales is now thinking in a joined up way around its approach to regulation and investment in places is moving in that direction as well. I think the challenge for the post-16 white paper in England is we still have separate bodies, the SFA, Skills England, OFS, running the system with different imperatives, and that happening in a very, very competitive environment. So quite challenging to get the kind of coherence and collaborative working that might be desired. And the extent to which this succeeds probably depends on whether the powers change, so whether there's any legislation that changed some of the powers and the obligations of the different bodies that are working across it, how the funding and regulatory rules work to cut through some of the incentives that flow from that, how institutions respond. Will competition essentially lead to divergence or actually lead to people working closer together in terms of sheltering? And then also the behaviour of learners. So will the demand for HE continue to increase, or actually, not least given some of the coverage over the last few weeks, will there be increasing thinking and desire to go through different routes? I'm just going to finish off by trying to put some of this in some flesh on some of this by looking at a couple of those maps that I told you about earlier, because it makes it a bit more real in terms of where we were in 2006 and where we are now, and the implications for institutions as well. So I'm going to start with the East of England, which is kind of what I was working on about 20 years ago. When we were working on this, we never used to use the word planning. So we never used the P word because there weren't planning powers in relation, certainly to the higher education part of the system. You know, you couldn't say there must be a chemistry department in a particular part of the country. But we did used to talk about scenarios, which was more in the territory of how could you use the levers that you have available across the higher education funders, the further education funders, the regional bodies, the local authorities, to get a coherent shape that would broadly meet the goals you were going for. And the goals you were aiming for were broadly higher levels of educational participation aligned with local needs. So the needs of local employers, public services, and access for local people. So that's broadly what we were trying to achieve. This is the 2006 map where we started from. And one of the interesting things in the East of England is how important transport is, broadly north-south, south-north, out of London. And in the East of England, that broadly means you have a kind of sphere going northwards and slightly westwards through Hertfordshire and Bedfordshire, a sphere in the middle that's going north up to Cambridge and beyond up to King's Lynn, and then a sphere out through coastal Essex and out towards Suffolk and Norfolk. And of course, in the East of England, you have a lot of very rural and coastal areas, along with some that are quite suburban in Hertfordshire and Essex and very closely linked to London. So a whole mix of different places. When we started on this in 2006, one university, Anglia Ruskin, which was based in Colchester and Cambridge, pretty much had the partnerships with FE colleges across most of the region, you know, certainly up to here and down here and up to here, up round Norwich. And they weren't very closely knit. It was a very loose set of partnerships. So we were thinking in terms of progression, how do we make this more coherent for learners and provide better pathways? The other things you had in the mix here was, I think I'm free to say, a very weak university in Luton, which was Luton University, with no real partnerships working effectively with the local colleges. And in some of these areas, colleges and universities working very separately. So where you ended up with that is you ended up with a set of university and college partnerships in Hertfordshire, a new university called Bedfordshire, which took on a campus run by a different university in Bedford, which had all the partnerships with the colleges there. So you had a kind of coherent sphere here. Anglia Ruskin worked up this way through from broadly South Essex to right up to King's Lynn, and there was an investment in new centres planned up here as well. And then a place with no higher education, no university, Suffolk, got a new university in Ipswich in the middle, which was essentially enabled by a partnership between UEA and Essex. So two separate universities ran it as a joint venture in a place, Ipswich, which was expected to grow because of its connections with London. And Essex also moved into Southend, which was a place without any higher education. A possible vision, and there was serious talk about this, is this all becomes one group. So UEA merges with Essex, with Suffolk in the middle. You get a big research university. From that, you also get an accessible higher education, more accessible higher education provision in Ipswich, and you have more college links right across the piece. And interesting to reflect where these people are now compared to that vision 20 years ago. What happened was from 2010, because of competition, a lot of these partnerships have broken up. So Suffolk is a separate university. It's quite a good, interesting mixed economy university with a lot of FE, but completely separate from UEA and Essex. Essex, as you've probably heard, has just pulled out of Southend. And actually the college, which was no part of that activity, has had to be brought back in to work with it. And colleges tend to work with universities all over the place rather than necessarily their neighbour. Indeed, competition means the neighbour might be the place they really don't want to work with because of competition. So some of that coherence has really dissipated during the period since. The interesting thing to reflect on as we move forward is, I guess I feel like people are talking again about coherence and geographical coherence and structures and configuration across HE and FE more than at any time before than 20 years ago. Although it's a lot more difficult now, I think, given the nature of the landscape. So the second example I've chosen, and apologies, this is a kind of fusing of a map of London with a map of Kent and Medway, but look at London and the southeast. And this is an area where there are some interesting things happening now, South and Southeast London and Kent and Medway. And it's happening in part because policy is encouraging it. So universities and colleges probably feel more positive that government will cut through some of the barriers to collaboration across the sectors, but also there's a degree of sheltering. So in a difficult and competitive climate, working together and getting in more group structures may be a way of navigating all of that. But it doesn't feel as geographically coherent as the map I showed you before. So in simple terms, London South Bank University is running a group with a group of colleges into South London, I think now extending down to Croydon, and looking at potentially a looser set of partnerships that enable progression around South London. You have a number of college groups, London and South East College, which is broadly the red area here, and then 3 college groups in Kent, I think, which are North, Mid and East Kent college groups, bringing the colleges together. And then, as you've probably heard, a university group partnership, which is building actually on a partnership that began in Medway 20 years ago, when we had those kind of plans around coherence and configuration, which runs all the way from Greenwich in South London across to Canterbury down here. And the idea is you have a single group with different missions, so could accommodate different things within it. And that's educationally interesting because of the different routes it can provide for people to come in. It's also spatially very interesting. It bridges between what you might identify as some of the big divisions in our society. You know, South London, prosperous, multicultural, growing population, to coastal Kent, which has a very different dynamic. And so there's opportunities for these structures really to cut through some of that fragmentation that I was talking about earlier. But if it's going to happen, I think there will need to be serious thought about how to cut through some of the regulatory and funding disincentives working across different sectors. It will be influenced by institutional behaviour and learner behaviour, and that might need to become a bit less gravitating up towards the top of the hierarchy. And that could well be shifted by attitudes towards higher education and debt over the next few years. And then it could well, given everything I've said before, just be affected by other events. That's it from me. I think over to you now, Leesa. Sorry, I spoke too long.
So the argument that Gavin and I are putting in this paper is that there is potential for dual sector institutions in a unified tertiary education sector, particularly in building pathways for students between the sectors in both directions, in developing new and innovative programs, in meeting economies of scale and serving regions that are underserved. And we think they have a particularly important role in social justice and social inclusion, and in meeting the needs of their communities with guided educational opportunities and so on. However, we have been here before. And this idea is not a new one. And it's important that we learn from the past. And unless policy confronts the institutional, political, and epistemological challenges in tertiary education, these efforts are going to struggle to succeed. So I'm just going to give you a bit of a, first of all, I'm just going to provide some context for why Gavin and I are talking about this stuff in any case. And that includes having a bit of a look at the structure of tertiary education. Then I'm going to try and look at some of the earlier discussions and debates that have been had around this issue. And in particular, I'm going to draw on the work of David Rafe, the late David Rafe from the University of Edinburgh, who largely draws on institutional theory, but his concepts of intrinsic and institutional logics is very helpful, and as is his designation of political, institutional, and epistemological barriers to working between sectors. Then I'm going to look at what is new, and then I've got some advice for dual sector institutions and policy before concluding with a final thought. So a few weeks ago, Gavin explored the extent to which he introduced us, and he explored on his paper on exploring the extent to which England has a tertiary education system. He explained that we both work at Victoria University of Technology, now just Victoria University, which is a dual sector university which has a TAFE division, which is Technical and Further Education Institute, just like FE here, and a higher education sector. Now, note, I do not say university sector. I'm reflecting the politics of the time, and that is because the university has two sectors and not one. And so this language really matters. TAFE primarily offers vocational education qualifications based on competency-based training models of curriculum, although in the last 20 years or so, many TAFEs have offered some higher ed, and I'll go into that in detail. Now, I started in VUT in 1994, first as a TAFE teacher. Then I was the executive officer working for the provost to try and set up a pathways framework from TAFE to higher ed in all fields of education, and then in the academic development unit, which worked with both sectors. Gavin started first in 1996 in the registrar's office, and then as a policy advisor to the provost, a different provost by this stage. Here we are, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. What he didn't tell you was that the very first time we met was when he and his boss requested the presence of my boss and me because we were in trouble. We were trying to enrol TAFE students in individual higher ed courses or subjects and have them count towards their TAFE diploma and pay TAFE fees and not higher ed fees. Now, this was against the rules and the structure of the world as we knew it. I'll never forget this. They asked us to put our hands on our hearts and swear we weren't trying to get around the fee schedules and enrolment rules, and that we weren't trying to set precedents. I'll let you work out what we might have said. Gavin claims that this took place 1 week before results were due, and that someone had a record of the results somewhere, perhaps on someone's spreadsheet or a piece of paper, perhaps under the bed, anywhere but the student information system. Eventually, the university tried to put something in place that would allow this to happen, but it was just too hard. I don't think it lasted. And here we are 30 years later, and our research has informed our practice, and our practice has informed our research. So after we worked in other universities in different capacities, but always focused on sectoral relationships and building pathways for students and also for staff to cross the sectoral divide. And our paper today draws on both our experience as practitioners and researchers in both Australia and Canada. Our experience at VU was very typical of the challenges confronting tertiary education, dual sectors. And so we wrote this report in 2000, and we thought the best way to convey this was to tell a story. So we told us an apocryphal tale of Jack and Jill at Twin Peaks University trying to set up an award that covered both sectors. The key point here is that Jack and Jill knew each other socially, which is fortunate because they would not have crossed paths otherwise, even though they're on the same campus at the time. And the location for this story is the dual sector university where we were working, and everything in this story actually happened. We changed the disciplines to disguise them, and my boss, who was the provost at the time, said he thought that this protected the guilty rather than the innocent. And anyone from a dual sector institution who read this tale thought it was about them, that we had somehow found out what had happened. So it was a fairly universal experience that people had. So an alternative title we could use is a realpolitik guide to dual sector institutions, which is probably more realistic. Now, I may give the impression that I don't think that dual sectors work or that they're not worth the trouble. That's just not true. I do think they are important and they are worth it. However, building effective dual sector institutions requires conscious leadership and commitment, and a determination to deal with the political, epistemological, and institutional issues that arise. So this is to give you a bit more context. Here's the map of Australia, which shows that England's landmass is 31 times smaller than Australia. England has that's the UK's landmass. England has a population of about 58 million in 2026, and Australia's is just over 28 million. We have two sectors of education in Australia, vocational education sector like FE and higher education. We have a smaller adult and community education sector with hundreds of small campuses. We have about 36 public universities and about 6 small private universities, 27 public TAFEs with campuses spread across the country, and about 2,700 private training providers, which is a big underestimate, but that's another story. The data's tricky. Power over education in Australia is shared between the Commonwealth and the states. The Commonwealth funds higher ed, but the states are responsible for vocational education, which this is a big complicating factor for the dual sectors. Even though the Commonwealth contributes substantial funding to vocational education, it does so through tied grants to the states. And so that means that the states do things differently. So vocational education in Victoria is organised quite differently compared to, say, New South Wales. As I said, I think before, there are 6 dual sector universities in Australia out of 36 public universities and 6 smaller ones. And we define a dual sector university as one which has a higher education component of about 20% of total student load and a TAFE component of about 20%. Now, the first 4 dual sector universities were in Victoria, which has a population of 7.3 million. It's the second highest population in the country, but it's the most densely populated. Yeah, that's the first place that the dual sectors arose. Then we had dual sectors in both Charles Darwin University in the Northern Territory, and it covers that vast territory, right? The UK fits into that many times over. And also then Central Queensland University is the most recent, and that's its patch there. Which is again a vast territory, but as a result of competitive market policies, Central Queensland now has campuses in Cairns, which is at the top of Australia, and capital cities in Brisbane, Sydney, Melbourne, Adelaide, and Jakarta. So it sort of makes sense for some of them, but the same logic doesn't apply for all of them. So here's the structure of provision in Australia. So on the far left, it shows that we have 27 TAFEs, 36 public universities, and in the middle are 6 dual sectors universities. On the right-hand side, it's a bit more complicated. It shows that at least 9 TAFEs offer higher education in their own right, accredited to offer higher education in their own right. However, that includes 3 TAFE systems: New South Wales, Queensland, and South Australia, which are whole systems, whereas in Victoria you have standalone individual TAFE institutes. So they do it differently. And that includes also the 6 TAFEs. So that's more than half of the TAFEs in Australia are either in a dual sector or offer higher education. As of this week, as of yesterday, 15 universities were registered on the National Register of Vocational Education Institutions to offer vocational education qualifications, which includes the 6 dual sectors. So you can see it's quite blurry, but really most of the action for the dual sectors is with the 6 dual sector institutions primarily. According to Australia's Tertiary Education Quality Standards Authority, about 44% of all institutions registered on the higher education register are also registered to deliver vocational education. So it's quite an important part of provision. However, this topic is not new. Since at least the 1990s, governments have been seeking greater permeability between the sectors, particularly as the purposes of the two sectors became more aligned around the focus of preparing people for work, and education became increasingly subordinated to preparing people for work. In that context, lifelong learning becomes an economic imperative. And growth in access meant that governments wanted easier pathways and more efficient and effective routes between the different sectors of education and in and out of work. And this was part of the key rationale for the establishment of national qualifications frameworks and so on. And there was some experimenting with dual sector institutions also here in the UK during this time. And this was reflected in the literature of the time. So, for example, David Rafe and his colleagues explained that the drive to unify post-compulsory education and training was important. This is in the late 90s, but it lacked clarity, is not widely recognised, and is pursued through different measures in different countries, but also within countries. And lots of research in the UK around this time and in the next 10 years reflected this. So Anne-Marie Bathmaker a couple of weeks ago talked about the big HE and FE project that she was involved in. And there are other colleagues such as Gareth Parry, Anne Thompson, Neil Garrett, Bruce McFarlane, Jim Gallagher in Scotland, Fiona Reeves, and many others researching HE and FE and the potential of dual sector institutions. And I urge policymakers to go back to this literature. There's a lot to learn. David Rafe's work in particular also provides insights, and that's what we are drawing on here. So what are some of the challenges in the sectoral divide? Well, David's work on institutional logics in education is very helpful, and I've got the list of references at the back of this in case anyone wants it. He distinguishes between intrinsic and institutional logics, and also he talks about political, institutional, and epistemological barriers. And so now, first of all, to look at intrinsic and institutional logics. An intrinsic logic for a reform provides the rationale for policies and policy reforms by specifying the reason, the purposes, and intended outcomes of the reforms. It's also the basis upon which reforms are attacked or justified in their own terms. So, for example, an example of an intrinsic justification, qualifications frameworks are good because they support lifelong learning. Outcomes-based education is good because it allows the customer to specify what they're buying. I don't necessarily agree with either of those statements, but it just gives you an idea of that, you know, these are the rationale in which reforms are put forward. However, he argues that intrinsic reforms are always mediated by the intrinsic logic's always mediated by the institutional logic, and the institutional logic exists at macro and micro levels. At the macro level, the institutional logic structures relations to stratification, power, and institutional structuring. At the micro level, it shapes practices, patterns, and interactions and values that underpin trust and credibility of qualifications, systems, and so on. And these can be applied at the systemic level, but also within institutions. And it's also useful to analyse relationships between between the systemic and the institutional. Understanding these logics sheds light on the way in which intrinsic logics underpinning reforms are understood, shaped, and implemented, and the outcomes are achieved. And it also helps explain why a system may persist with reforms that have failed to achieve the outcomes specified by the intrinsic logic, when it's clear that this is not working. For example, that competency-based training will result in better links between vocational education and the labour market, even though it hasn't happened. It's the institutional logic that helps us to understand why this is the case. And the institutional logic governing our systems, at least in Anglophone countries, is high participation, what Simon Marginson calls a high participation tertiary education system, which has a gross tertiary tertiary enrolment rate of more than 50%. Now, most countries rich countries have achieved this, and this is the trajectory for many mid-income and low-income countries. And Simon explains that as systems have grown, they've become more hierarchical and stratified, and resources of class and power matter, particularly in providing privileged access to the elite sections of the system. Different types of higher education result in different types of outcomes, and the institutional logic of a high participation system shapes relations between sectors. At the system level, it shapes the relationship between the higher education and the FE sector, or the vocational education sector. In this hierarchical structuring, higher education is positioned at a higher status than vocational education, and within higher education, some institutions are positioned more highly than others. Now, this has led to lots of calls for parity of esteem between vocational education and higher education. I'm not trying to single out the minister here, but this statement that she's got here is very typical of calls for parity of esteem. We just need to recognise that these are equal forms of education and everything will be okay. That does not happen anywhere, and it's not going to happen. And the problem is for vocational education in many jurisdictions, particularly in Anglophone liberal market economies, is that the status of vocational education is low because it prepares students for lower status occupations. An important principle is that a pathway is valued by the destination to which it leads, and overall, the outcomes are still better for those with degrees, and asserting the higher status of vocational education will not make it higher status. I want to now look at challenges for dual sector institutions within stratified and hierarchical systems. And here I'm going to look at Rafe's concepts of political, institutional, and epistemological barriers. So the sectors structure relations and establish hierarchies within the sectors and between the sectors and within dual sector institutions. And between the sectors and within the dual sector institutions, we have struggles for control over curriculum, and we have different accreditation, regulatory funding, reporting, industrial and quality assurance regimes, all of which make it very difficult. We also have sectoral champions on each side of the fence who emphasise their separate missions. And in particular, we used to have in vocational education in Australia people on the barricades yelling that TAFE is not a feeder for higher education. Our view was that when one sector is higher in status, is higher funded, has more autonomy than the other sector, with better career structures, that this will inevitably be reproduced within dual sector institutions. And instead of denying that these problems exist, explicit policies need to be put in place to navigate the sectoral divide. So what are some of these institutional problems? Well, in 2008, Gavin produced a report which is very helpful, where he distinguishes between single sector, mixed sector, and dual sector institutions. A single sector institution is one which has 97% or more of its enrolments in one sector. And when that's the case, when you've got about 3% of your load or less enrolled in the other sector, someone can manage that on the side of their desk and meet all the sectoral requirements. In a mixed sector institution, they have the most problems in handling provision in the other sector, because even though the provision in the other sector may be big enough to be important, it's not yet at the scale where the institution as a whole has instigated the administrative funding, governance and quality assurance requirements for the minority sector. And if it's at the lower end of the scale, it's usually handled by a couple of people. And if they leave, there is a crisis, because that institutional memory has walked out the door and no one knows what to do. Dual sector institutions, on the other hand, have economies of scale. They must implement the necessary infrastructure to manage both sectors. Now, the mixed sector institutions often claim that they've overcome the problems with the sectoral divide. For example, TAFEs have claimed that when they offer higher education, they don't have the same sectoral problems that the dual sectors have. community colleges in Ontario and Canada say the same thing. We say that's absolutely not true, that they do reproduce the sectoral divide within those institutions. They also, dual sector institutions also have to deal with the dead weight of administrative requirements such as timetabling, information systems, quality assurance, course reviews, industrial awards, funding, and so on. And it's compounded in Australia with different levels of government. Now, this may sound completely bizarre, but a big issue in every campus that we ever went to in Australia was car parking. And I can explain why at another time, maybe over a beer or something like that. What we think is perhaps the most under-theorised and in many ways the most important and most problematic problem is the epistemological problems. Now, on the one hand, political and institutional problems are often disguised as epistemological issues. The separatists on both sides insist on a different mission, but is it that different? I mean, perhaps there is a big difference between academic and professional or academic and vocational education. But if we look at the role of universities in training for the professions, how different is that in purpose for FE, which is training people for occupational destinations? But on the other hand, the sectoral champions for dual sectors deny any differences in epistemology, and that means that the issue can't be addressed if it's only seen as an issue of self-interest. And in our experience, that competency-based training curriculum is a very poor basis for progression from FE to HE, but we'll go into that more. So what is new? Well, I think curricular differentiation is diminishing because of the skills agenda. It's particularly the latest skills paper, which emphasises that the purpose of all education, including higher education, is to produce skills. This is usually based on outcomes-based education or competencies. And this comes from the vocational education sector where it first originated. Now, we did warn higher ed 20 years ago, this will happen to you one day, you need to help us fight this, but, and here we are. So I think that we've seen convergence between the sectors in a way that we haven't seen before as a result of this. Now, some of the things that are new, for example, the lifelong learning entitlement for all students, that is maybe an opportunity to support greater coherence across the sectors. But on the other hand, if funding follows students and not institutions, to what extent will that result in place-based partnerships and provision or more marketisation and competition? How will the separate sectoral funding, governance and quality assurance arrangements be dealt with? Now, finally, I just want to end. And the other emphasis, the other thing that's different perhaps now is the emphasis on place-based approaches with less focus on markets and more on regional coordination. Here's some realpolitik advice. Management has to really want this for it to happen and be prepared to act against the higher education sector when needed. For example, to prevent them from stealing students from the vocational education sector to meet load in the higher ed sector. We've seen that so many times. Management has to include senior people from the vocational education sector in senior management. Create pathways for staff to move sectors and not just for students, for example, for teachers to do EdDs and PhDs. Fund staff who can make it happen. And two other points, emphasise curricular coherence between the sectors within fields of study and build opportunities for staff to build social capital. Governance is the key to this within dual sector institutions, but also between single sector institutions that seek to build partnerships. You're not going to have a partnership unless you work out the governance arrangements. It keeps everyone accountable, allows for joint projects, pathways and agreements. So what are the governance arrangements for place-based approaches going to be? Now, an existential crisis. Okay, an existential crisis for the college component of a dual sector institution is not necessarily an existential crisis for the higher ed component. We saw this in Australia in the scorched earth marketisation policies in Victoria, where the 4 of the 6 dual sectors are, where the government, where TAFE was absolutely savage as a result of the cutbacks, the university just sliced up bits as a form of self-preservation. On the other hand, an existential crisis for the HE component within a dual sector university is usually a crisis for the college component, because the HE component will cannibalise students and undermine the college. Boundary spanners are essential to this. A boundary spanner is someone whose job it is to help navigate the sectoral divide within the institution, and who understands the political realities of and life in each sector, who knows what it's like to go to work on Monday in the other sector, and who reports to someone senior in the institution who's senior enough, for example, the provost, so they have authority within the institution. Such a person is then able to go to the Dean of Engineering and say, the provost really wants this pathway, and to be able to stare down any sort of opposition in that way. And in our experience, unless you have someone in that kind of role to act as an internal enforcer as much as a bridge to the other sector, it is very difficult to build relationships between the sectors. Now, final thoughts. Can this be done? I'm not sure. I think perhaps supporting mixed sector institutions to offer high level provision could be another alternative in thinking about this. It doesn't overcome the problems of the sectoral divide, but if the weight of provision at the college level, which is at ISCEP level 5 and below, if the weight of provision stays at that level while they offer a big chunk of higher education provision, it means that the needs of both sectors must be met and not just higher education, and it can't be carved off as easily. And some examples of where this is happening is colleges in Ontario are increasing the percentage of degrees they can offer as part of their load, and they're also now allowed to offer master's degrees. But we need to build economies of scale to overcome problems with mixed sector institutions. Final question, and maybe the Fachhochschulen in Germany provides a model for us to look at if we're serious about this. So that is it. Thank you.
Chris, for your presentation. We have now around 25 minutes for questions and comments. I'm going to try to take one question from online and one question from the room and so on. I already saw that there are some questions, some comments online. I don't know, Hugh, Morris, I don't know if you want to unmute yourself and make your question.
Yeah, thanks very much. That's really helpful, and two fantastic presentations. Really, really grateful for that. I wrote a question which was for Chris, but as Lisa's talk went on, it seemed to me it also might be of interest to her. It seems to me that a big issue is governance, but not at the individual institution level, at something like a regional footprint level. I worked in Hertfordshire and Bedfordshire in the 90s and 2000s, and in Kent I've been back and forth for many years. There were significant institutional failures in those parts of the world and failed mergers because the governance infrastructure, struck me, beyond the institution, was weak. I could go into the details of that. I mentioned some of it last week. Could you say a little bit about governance? I mean, I don't think it's necessarily a case of having to have dual sector institutions, but I know, for example, Kent has a population of 1.7 million. There are 10 US states with populations lower than that are able to manage their systems on that footprint. And there are 6 European Union countries with populations lower than that who are able to manage their own systems. And the Oxford-Cambridge ARC has 3.8 million people, and there are countless states running systems at that level. So I wonder if you could say something about governance, and then I'll come back if that's okay.
Shall I start? Yeah, I mean, I don't know how much this is about governance of individual institutions or governance of in a sense, local governance and the kind of devolution agenda and where power lies in terms of different activities and funding is potentially relevant to both. I suppose if you roll back to the 2006 maps, we were able to have a fairly coherent landscape because there were single funders of higher education and further education, a regional development agency, a learning and skills council, and then some local authorities. And so you could pretty much combine recurrent and capital funding and land to do a lot across both sectors and have a conversation involving 5 people, which would lead to provision working. I think we do have, as I was saying in my session, a much more fragmented landscape now, both in terms of the further and higher education institutions and the way in which they work with each other, and in terms of the kind of devolved government geography, where we obviously have some places that have increasingly mature mayors and universities and colleges thinking in a more and more coherent way about how they can operate within those structures, and other places without any of that and an uncertain timescale for it. So my general view is we need a national framework within which local partnerships can happen, but that won't be the same everywhere. And the place in which partnership works for me is where the relationships of trust and just conversations I've had over the last year or so. That is probably Birmingham, not the West Midlands. It's South Yorkshire, not Yorkshire. It's a kind of relationship of trust at a geographically meaningful level. And we have to think about how we can work at those levels and work strongly in advance where it can work, because there are those relationships to start with and build out from there.
Yeah, I mean, I would absolutely agree with that. When Gavin and I were at Griffith University, that was a single sector university, and we had partnerships with about 3 of the TAFEs that were in our geographic region, and that was an extremely successful partnership while it lasted, because there were there was reporting, there was accountabilities, there were projects, there were things that we did together. It meant that, for example, that the Pathways officer would bring reports back to the governing body, to the governing committee, explaining what progress the TAFE students had made in their degrees, their GPA and all that sort of stuff. I mean, it just kept everyone engaged and involved. It meant that we were able to put in place joint research projects, put in place joint bids for special nursing programs and all sorts of things. So for me, unless the governance is underpins the partnership, it's not going to work just because people think it's a nice idea. There's got to be some sort of institutional framework to support it. And it also really does need boundary spanners. You can't just expect it to happen just of its own. You need a pathways officer, particularly at the university, whose job it is to go out and actually make it happen, and then to try and convince people inside the university that this really matters. And so I think those two things go together. In the absence of all this, you're going to get the local FE college wanting to collaborate with the university 200 miles away, rather than in their local network. We saw that in Canada too, in Ontario, so we saw community colleges there partnering with colleges, with universities in other provinces. Why? About 2 people were going to ever do that pathway. It didn't make any sense. So if you want to build this, I think it has to be an expectation of policy, it has to be funded, and it has to be staffed.
Obviously, autonomy is just a key influential feature of our system, and that's not going to change. And it's an important part of our system, as far as particularly the higher education part of it. So you've got to find ways of working with autonomy, because it's not going to change. And that means thinking about, well, certainly some of the autonomy universities will be willing to give up autonomy if there are opportunities that flow from that in terms of funding, etc. Or indeed, if the challenges are so great that they just need to embrace something different. So it's thinking about how you can work with autonomy, but take it in directions that make sense. I'm going to obviously not prolong the conversation, but other relationships based on trust, but there are divorce laws to stop people walking away.
There's a big university in South Wales which walked away from its FE partnerships and destroyed all the trust for the next 20 years. If there had been some governance procedure that prevented that happening quickly, things would have been a lot better for the long run. I mean, I'll leave it at that. But autonomy is an historic feature in the UK, and Reform UK isn't. One of those things is more likely to win in the near future.
Dolly, come back and talk to you about that in a few years.
Yeah.
Yeah, I had two questions on dual sector institutions. Leesa, super fascinating piece. One was, you didn't mention, like, it seems like there's a precondition of this is that you're able to employ people within the organization under very different working conditions, right, to operate in the two sectors. So I'm curious about the tensions of, or the flexibilities required to be able to operate, right? Because they're effectively two employment regimes for instructors. So that was one question.
Not just instructors, admin staff too.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that was one piece. The second piece I was wondering about was the most prominent dual sector institutions I can think of are the French universities, right? With the IUTs within them. Just curious if you have thoughts on those, what works there, like, because I think in the French system, right, sometimes those, not to go back to ISCED, but those ISCED, I can't remember what they're called, the ISCED 5 programs that they have are almost higher prestige than the bachelor's degrees in France, right? And so maybe is that part of why they would? Do you know kind of why they work? Because they've been around forever.
They're better funded. They're hugely better funded than academic universities.
But I mean, just on the dual sector institutions, on the different industrial awards, yes, that is a huge issue. Academics are paid more than teachers. They're on different industrial awards and have different unions usually, and that is a cause of tension. Now, what happened at Victoria University is we had different mergers at different times, and then whenever we merged with a TAFE, their admin staff would come in, and they were on a different award and different levels of pay, and then the university had to, in one go, put them all on the same industrial award, because while you can have TAFE teachers and academics on different industrial awards, because, you know, everything they do is completely different, you can't make the same argument for administrative staff. And so when administrative staff were brought into the merger, it cost the university millions to try and equalise the pay and conditions. Gavin, what do you think? I mean, just in relation
Charlie Darwin.
Yeah, Charles Darwin was the only university that tried to put all its staff on the same industrial award. I'm not sure how that went, but that was a big experiment. They could do it partly because they're a smaller university and they were the only university in the territory. Gavin, if not the IUTs, what about the Fachhochschule and in Germany? Do you think that offers a model in terms of institution that offers higher level provision? No?
Well, it's like the Polys here or the CAEs in Australia.
Well, that's what I'm saying might be a good approach. You don't think so?
Good.
Good.
Is there any question online?
I think Nick Hillman had a question. I don't know if he's still online.
Nick? It seems that.
Was it me suggesting the current white paper is more coherent than it really is? I'll answer that. Yeah, I mean, I think it's certainly the case that if you look at the white papers I showed in 2004 and 2016, you could see how that was going to lead quite clearly to legislation, and that happened. Yeah. So they were very advanced, and there was a clear vision that led to quite fundamental change to the landscape. I think in 2024, it feels further away from that. It feels more, as much green as white. And that's partly because it feels to me the landscape is such a long way from that vision that they're looking for in terms of the bodies responsible, the behaviours of the institutions, and indeed the levers available to government once you've given a lot, particularly in the higher education space, a lot of funding over to others. So it feels like it's more what than how at this point. And I suspect during the coming years, there'll be an endeavour to try and make the existing structures deliver as best possible that vision for a more coherent and joined up system that's more responsive to different needs in places. But it would take legislation really to change it more fundamentally.
There is another question online. Zachary, sorry if I mispronounce your name. Do you want to unmute?
Really nice to hear from Leesa and Chris. Fantastic presentations as ever. Leesa, you've really just reminded me of everything that I researched, looked at, read as part of my own PhD, and indeed the definitions of what dual sector institutions or universities are about. My question really is, I think, you made a reference to mixed sector, dual sector colleges in particular, and what we haven't touched on so far is the degree awarding powers for colleges. And one of the things that strikes me is, given that I've been obviously working with colleges for quite some time, and college higher education has been shrinking year on year, the numbers have been declining. What's your sort of experience and thoughts on anything that you're able to draw on from examples from elsewhere? For example, looking at the potential for colleges with their own degree awarding powers to grow or expand their higher education, because we've been touching on the dynamics, the power dynamics, and the competition between universities and colleges throughout this presentation, both yours as well as Chris to some extent. Thanks.
So the systems that I know the best are the Anglo systems. And in the Anglo systems, in Canada, in Ontario, the US, Australia, and the UK, it's not usually the case that colleges have self-awarding powers in that they can be self-accrediting institutions. So I know there are a couple of colleges here that have that authority, but they're a very small minority. That is, that they can develop, accredit, and determine quality assure and offer a degree or higher education provision in their own right. In most cases, I think the UK has always had much more of an emphasis on franchising, which is very risky for the colleges, I have to say, because it's just you got to just have an enrolment crisis, and then the university pulls all its students back, which is what happened here some years ago. In Australia and Ontario in Canada, and also in many community colleges in the United States, the college has to get external accreditation of its degree in order for it to be able to offer that degree and to be able to call it a degree. Now, in the early stages of colleges offering degrees, I don't think that is a bad thing, because I think that colleges actually do have to work out what it means to become higher education providers, and that's not necessarily that straightforward. It's not particularly the same processes as you put in place for vocational education types of qualifications, but more than that, it gives the public an assurance that this credential or this qualification is at the same standard as any degree offered by a university. And so if you talk about college degrees in Ontario, some of us might get a bit upset. I mean, I think Professor Michael Skolnick is online from Ontario. We would say, yes, it is a degree. It is the same as a degree as any university would offer. And so I think that there's it has that role. I think it is better for colleges, if they're going to offer higher education, to be able to offer it in their own right. But some of the time they will need to work in partnership with universities, as long as they have some protections in place against pulling back of their students.
Zachary, we are going to go with your question first, and then we can go with John. Zachary, you can unmute yourself.
Yeah, thanks very much, colleagues. And hello from the Pacific Northwest out here in the United States. I think, first, thank you very much for the time, space, and presentations. My question really revolves around the informal, specifically both colleagues talk about the formalized relations and the formal attributes of university and further education institutions, and how that creates, if you will, distinct or meaningful separations in how we discuss and position them internally and externally in relation. You often use the term boundary spanner. Having just completed a 2-year appointment in a land-grant university, focusing on community and public engagement, we use this term a lot to describe people who do the work you are talking about. And I'm just wondering if it's possible, maybe you could explore whether or not those informal relations and the way in which those informal relationships occur and build actually allow for more of these formalized futures that maybe would be more sustainable than just, I mean, there's a bunch of authorship, as I understand it, from the UK context about the distinct and purposefully distinct nature of a university and a non-university further education institution. I mean, Michael Shattuck, Michael Sanderson, etc., have talked about this. A number of white papers you all have mentioned, right? So I'm just wondering if overcoming that is something we leave to the more informal relations we do over time. Thank you.
It feels to me that's relevant to the discussion we had before about relationships of trust.
Yeah.
So a lot of activity happens in this space because of a diverse set of relationships between people working in the same subject areas, in neighbouring institutions, and that will always carry on. And whatever you do, you don't want to establish such structured relationships that it stops those happening. So it may well always be the case that two people want to work together across a larger geographical scale, because academically that makes sense because of the character of the course. I think the problem we're identifying is that there's so many disincentives in the system for this to work. So how do you create a system that provides better incentives for it, so you're not just reliant on those kind of informal relationships, even if that's a key part of it?
I think I didn't go into it in my presentation, but I think that trust is absolutely key to the whole thing. You get better pathways between the sectors when the people when staff from both institutions know each other, when often the FE teacher or the TAFE teacher is a graduate of that university and of that program. When they work together to go through the curriculum, go through the assessment, you get better pathways with more credit for students than you do if you try and impose block requirements at the state level or at the federal level. That's what we've found in our work, that formally imposed pathways, here we have a qualifications framework. It says that a diploma should be worth this, therefore, that university has to give it. They will find ways to get around that. If, however, you have close relationships between the staff, then that always results in better pathways. And that's why it's really important to build opportunities to build social capital if those networks aren't in place. At the dual sector university that Gavin and I worked at, we set up a field of study framework for the university that brought together people in the same fields of study, engineering and science. They had never met each other. They had never met each other. And it was only because we forced them to go into a room together that they united in their opposition to management imposing this process on them, that they started to actually build pathways together. So it's really important that you focus on those sorts of opportunities.
John Brennan?
Yes, hello. Couple of related things that I would like to make. First one is that recognizing that as we get older, history gets larger. And one of the things that I'm very conscious of these days, that in the British higher education system, the majority of our universities were something else before they ever became universities. And I think that also relates then to cultural issues with further education colleges, to to what extent are they aiming to become a university at some stage? And a related point, I think, that I would make, over the years, I've done quite a lot of projects on graduate employment. And just thinking back to one I did as part of a European project, that whereas with most countries, working out the what graduate employment was influencing, it was to do with what you had studied shaped what you were going to, what kind of work you were going to get. However, on the British part of the project, it wasn't what you had studied, it was where you had studied that was that was important. So the change over time is my point. And you know, when we're looking at what's happening today, to what are the future plans of different institutions in terms of the diversity of the system today. What will it be like tomorrow?
Okay, thanks, John. You look like you're at the Winter Olympics or something. Screen, but so on the upward, I guess what you're describing is a system that kind of pulls upwards, and in a way that the way the higher education register works is it enables institutions to get funding and like a degree awarding power as a private university title and system over time. And there are reasons why people do that for prestige and brand, but also funding as well. And that's not necessarily building incentives in the system to encourage the system to kind of be horizontal rather than vertical, and horizontally responding to different needs rather than vertically hierarchical. I think if you want to shift that, well, you've got to find better incentives in the system, which is about the funding that's available for different activities. I think there's a kind of really important moment at the moment about thinking about how much we want to continue with this very open higher education system that's enabling more and more providers to come in and grow, or something that's more managed and controlled. And I think we're probably heading for a bit of an inflection point around that. I think your broader point was about stratification in the system, where you've studied as much as what you've studied, and then that's a part of our system as it's a part of others. I know it's a real challenge for universities and colleges that are trying to do the right thing, perhaps particularly universities for their local area, and have governing bodies, as I was saying to Leesa earlier, that are saying, but why are we not moving up the league tables? And again, it's a question about how you can build better incentives into the system, although we're not going to abolish a world of league tables or competition or higher the environment we're working in.
No, that's good.
There is 2 minutes for a very short question. If the last one, if there is someone here in the room. Catherine?
I was just going to, and this is a short question, but is it worth it? This is hugely messy, challenging, really, really hard. That's what I'm hearing. And I'm just thinking about it from the perspective of the student and asking myself kind of what's the kind of gain from their perspective.
I think it is worth it. I mean, it may sound like I'm not in favour of them, but I am actually. And I think it is worth it for students. I think when the dual sectors or dual partnerships are working well, that it provides opportunities for students that they would not otherwise have. I think particularly for dual sector institutions that are located in working class and immigrant areas, where there's not a lot of cultural capital about how the whole thing works, to be able to go to a FE class and for the teacher to say, you should go and do the degree. And then to have someone from the university come and talk to those students, to have previous students come back, I think that's where it does become worth it. It does really create opportunities for students, particularly those who don't come from generations of cultural capital, where they know if they go to that school, they're going to end up at Oxford, perhaps, without actually having to think about it too much, or they know exactly what courses they're going to do. The other thing that we were able to do with these pathways is we were able to ensure that when students did their TAFE course, that they did exactly the right combination of courses and modules that would guarantee them the maximum amount of credit in the degree. And without cultural capital, we can't do that. And so that's where I think that dual sector institutions can play an important role in supporting social inclusion and social justice.
Well, thank you very much, Leesa and Chris, for your wonderful presentation. Thank you everyone online and here in the room for your questions and comments and for engaging with this discussion today and in the previous seminars. Next week, we have a seminar with Dr. Xin Xu and myself, and we are going to be exploring the purposes of tertiary education. And what we did was going to ask different stakeholders about how they envision the purpose of this new integrated system. So we are going to share a little bit about that next week. And here you can also see some other events that we are organizing in the center. So you can find all the information in our website. Also, you are going to find this presentation and this recording in our YouTube channel next week. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That's good.
No,
Yeah. So